The echoing screams. The hospital stood like a forgotten monument of tragedy. It had been abandoned for decades, but no one dared go near it, not even the local teenagers who liked to test their courage with dares. It was not because the structure was unstable or because of some local law. No, it was something else, something darker, something that chilled the bones of anyone who ventured too close. They said the screams still echoed through its decaying halls. It was always the same story. A whisper passed through the town of Hollowbrook, howling winds and desperate cries that would seep into the streets on nights when the air felt heavy with rain. Some said it was just the wind playing tricks on people's ears. But the ones who had entered, those reckless enough to step inside its dilapidated walls, claimed they heard the truth. The screams were real, and they weren't just the sounds of pain. They were the sounds of fear. Isaac had never believed in ghost stories. He was a practical man, a cynic even, who scoffed at the tales told by locals when he moved to Hollowbrook. He had recently bought a small farmhouse on the outskirts of town, looking for a quiet place to escape his past life in the bustling city. To him, Hollowbrook was just a sleepy little town with more superstitions than sense. So, when the whispers of the old hospital reached his ears, he dismissed them as nothing more than folk tales, cheap thrills to keep kids in line. But curiosity gnawed at him. It started one evening while he was sitting alone in his home. The rain was pattering gently on the roof, and the air was thick with humidity. As he sipped his coffee, a sudden, distant sound cut through the rhythmic tapping of the rain, something like a scream. Isaac froze, the cup hovering inches from his lips. It wasn't a single scream, though. It was layered, as if multiple voices were crying out at once. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he strained to listen. The sound dissipated almost as quickly as it had come, leaving Isaac in silence. He shook his head, trying to rationalize what he had heard. "It's just the wind," he muttered to himself, his voice lacking conviction. But the scream had planted a seed in his mind. A few days later, Isaac found himself standing in front of the old hospital. The building was even more imposing up close. The stone exterior had weathered over the years, cracks running through it like veins. Windows were broken or boarded up, and the front door hung off its hinges, inviting the brave or foolish to step inside. He had read a little about the hospital before coming. It had been a functioning psychiatric hospital until the 1970s, when a fire swept through the West Wing. Dozens of patients and staff had perished in the blaze, and after that, the place was shut down, left to rot. Isaac wasn't here for a thrill. He was here to prove to himself that the hospital was nothing more than an empty shell of brick and mortar, no ghosts, no screams, just silence. But as he crossed the threshold into the lobby, the air changed. It was colder inside, unnaturally so. The smell of mildew and decay hung thick in the air, but underneath it was something else, a faint metallic scent that turned his stomach. He stepped deeper into the hospital, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The place was a maze of narrow hallways and broken furniture. Graffiti covered the walls, and water stains stretched across the ceiling like spider webs. As he walked, he could hear his own footsteps echoing off the tile floors, each step a reminder of how alone he was. But then another sound joined his own, a faint rustling, like someone shuffling just out of sight. Isaac stopped, holding his breath as he listened. The sound faded. Probably just the wind, he muttered, pushing forward. He found himself in what looked like an old waiting room. The chairs were overturned, the walls scarred with burn marks from the fire. On the far side of the room, a door led deeper into the hospital. As Isaac approached, he noticed something strange. This door was sealed, not with a lock, but with heavy chains. The kind of chains you use to keep something out, or to keep something in. Isaac felt a prickle of unease. The locals had mentioned a specific room in the hospital, one that had been locked since the fire. It was said that this was where the screams came from, the epicenter of whatever horror haunted this place. Isaac wasn't sure if this was the same door, but something inside him urged him to leave it alone. Still, he pressed on. The door wouldn't budge, but Isaac noticed a small gap near the bottom, just large enough for his flashlight beam to penetrate. He crouched down, shining his light into the room beyond. At first, he saw nothing but the charred remains of furniture and debris. But then, something moved, a shadow, quick and sharp, darting out of sight. Isaac stumbled back, his heart racing. He had seen it. He had definitely seen something move in there. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, and for the first time, he felt a genuine sense of fear. Not the kind of fear that came from ghost stories or the unknown, but the primal fear that something was watching him. That night, Isaac couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that shadow flickering at the edge of his vision. And worse, he heard the screams. They were louder now, more insistent, as if they were coming from just outside his window. He got up, pacing the room, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. At around 3 a.m., Isaac made a decision. He couldn't leave it alone. He had to know what was in that room. The hospital was even more menacing under the cover of night. The moonlight cast long, jagged shadows across the ground, and the wind howled through the broken windows like a chorus of wailing souls. Isaac retraced his steps to the sealed door, his heart pounding in his chest. The chains were still in place, but they looked older, more fragile in the pale light. With a sense of urgency, he began pulling at them, hoping to break the seal. And then, just as he was about to give up, he heard it, a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, crying out in pain, followed by another voice, and another. The screams overlapped, filling the hallway with an unbearable cacophony of anguish. Isaac froze, his breath catching in his throat. The screams were real. The chains fell away with a heavy clatter, and the door creaked open, revealing a darkened room beyond. Isaac hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The room was small, barely more than a storage closet. But the moment he entered, the temperature plummeted. His breath fogged in the air, and his flashlight flickered before sputtering out, leaving him in total darkness. And then the screams started again. But this time, they weren't distant. They were right there with him, all around him. The walls vibrated with the force of them, and Isaac clamped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The screams drilled into his mind, filling his head with images of fire and pain, of faces twisted in agony. Through the noise, he could hear something else, a soft, shuffling sound like someone dragging themselves across the floor. Isaac's heart raced as he backed up against the wall, his eyes wide in the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her skin blackened and charred, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, but the noise that filled the room came from somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond this world. Isaac tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure reached out to him, her hands skeletal and burned, her fingers curling around his wrist. And then the pain hit. It was as if his skin was being peeled away, layer by layer. His body burned from the inside out, and his screams, joined the others, echoing through the hospital, through the town, through the night. The next morning, the people of Hollowbrook woke to silence. There were no screams, no howling wind, just an eerie calm that settled over the town like a shroud. Isaac was never seen again, but those who passed by the old hospital claimed they could still hear the echo of his screams, mingling with the others, forever trapped in that place of forgotten pain and eternal terror.